Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of the program with Professor Bolaji Akinyemi. Prof, good evening, sir. You're welcome to the program again.
Thank you very much. It's usually the highlight of my week, so I am happy to be back here.
Yes, Prof. Was looking at the details of the stream, and I noticed that we are week 51. You are almost a year old, Prof.
Well, so that is not misunderstood, I'm not a year old. Actually, I'm getting near 80 years, maybe. The program is almost 1 year old.
Yes, but Prof,
So you
80
are,
is a good number.
well, I don't know.
Moses started at 80.
Really? All right. I will remind my wife and my children that. Thank you for reminding me.
Uh, Prof, before we go into the program this evening, there's been a lot going on around the world and lots to touch on today. But I wanted to get your views on the issue going on in the world of tennis, where we've seen Naomi Osaka come out of the tournament because of personal reasons. And that has caused quite a lot of hoo-ha around the place. Prof, what is your view? I know you love sports and you love tennis.
And I love Naomi Osaka. Um, you see, things crop up from time to time that shows the difference between African culture and European culture. As soon as she said she wasn't going to do the press interview, they slammed a fine on her and threatened her with expulsion. So she then said, fine, I'll walk away rather than risk my mental health. Of course, it has now become an issue in Western civilization that once mental health is mentioned, you back off because there are so many people who have suffered were in silence and who, when they then come out, they ask, they expect sympathy. Now, what did the organizers of the French Open do? Oh, they expressed sympathy with her and that they will not be prepared to enter into dialogue with players when it comes to mental issues. But did they write off the penalty they had imposed on her? No. When it comes to money, Europeans will do anything for money, even if it means sacrificing the mental or psychological or any type of human health. They will sacrifice all that just to quote them. If this were an African organization operating under African culture, not under Western culture, they will write off that fine and refund that money to her. But the Western Open, so really, the Western Open hasn't done that. So to me, there's the expression of sympathy and they're prepared to hold talks. All that to me are fake. It doesn't, I mean, they've said it because people expect them to say so, and they want to avoid the heavens falling on them if they didn't say so. If they knew that they really meant it, they would have written off that fine. Secondly, of course, I feel for Naomi. These players are often under considerable strain to perform and to win. And more often than not, they confront pressmen who have no experience themselves in being on the court. They don't know what it is to feel that pressure day in, day out. The pressure you feel, but already they are talking about your next opponent. They don't even let you revel or relax in one victory before so the pressure on these players, especially tennis, at least in football, you are one of 12 members, even though you also have to confront, but then yours is week to week. But in tennis, it's the following day. You have to appear on the court again. And obviously, I'm sure a lot of the young ones have suffered in silence. And now you have Naomi saying, no, my mental health is more important than tennis. My mental health is more important than facing unsympathetic questions from pressmen who are just trying to trip you so as to make their own headlines. And everything is about money. It's about money. The operators of the tennis opens obviously make, I suppose, they think it increases their intake when the press gives them that kind of constant open, harassing not the operators, harassing not the organizers, but harassing the players. I have seen I have seen referees in tennis make atrocious decisions, and yet the press doesn't go after them. But if one player says something off the court that is, not up to it, or they will roast him or roast her. I say these are not human beings that are allowed to make mistakes. So I feel for her. I think she took the right decision, and I believe they, they should refund the fine they leveled on her.
Thank you for that, Prof. Um, let's move on to Iran. There's quite a lot that is going on with Iran in the last sort of 2 weeks, 3 weeks. First, there was the incident of the US monitoring some Iranian ships. Then we've had a fire on one of their ships. And then the refinery, we've also had issues in one of their oil refineries. Prof, help us make sense about what is going on with Iran.
What's going on is very understandable to any scholar of strategic studies or defense studies, or even international affairs. There are a lot of countries who are interested in cutting Iran to size. Iran doesn't help matters by the kind of bellicose statements that they make from time to time, either from the Ayatollah or from the head of the Revolutionary Guard. You will notice that those bellicose statements are never made by the president or the foreign minister. They are usually from this, well, one cannot say that they are non-state actors, because in the case of the Iranian system, they are state actors, but they are not normal state actors. They run parallel with the government agencies. So Iran doesn't help matters. It doesn't help itself, because those who wish it ill can cite so many antagonistic statements made within the past 2 weeks targeting different targets. Now, we don't know. I mean, first of all, these are not coincidences. They were planned, whether it's the shipping of the naval ship, whether it's the burning of the refinery, they were all planned. They were not, I mean, the Iranians are not that useless in terms of competence. And we know who well, the, the regular the regular targets are, the regular agents, suspected agents who will have done this. But since I don't have any facts at my disposal to point directly at one person, let me just say this could be United States, this could be Saudi Arabia, this could be Israel. And of course, don't forget that even there are Iranians who are opposed to the regime. So depending on their own capability, they also may be
Prof,
people who set up these things.
there is a question here regarding Venezuela and Iran. It seems that there is a bit of an alliance that is building up between those two countries. Is it something new to have that alliance building? And what is the strategic importance of an Iran-Venezuela alliance?
Well, almost what is playing now in Venezuela almost reminds me of Cuban-American relations, how Fidel Castro survived all, practically all American administrations, and what they had to throw at him to get rid of him, which they couldn't until he died of natural causes. Now, as far back as Bush the son, as far back as his administration, American administration has been hitting at Venezuela. They even tried to sponsor 2 coups now, which never got off the ground. They've crippled the economy by getting American operators away from drilling for crude oil. And with the absence of the crude oil, the refineries of Venezuela had been crippled. And they had also, through the system of threats and sanctions put in place, they have practically driven away oil companies from supplying crude to Venezuela. And so the enemy of my enemy is my friend. It works in personal affairs just as it works in foreign affairs. The United States targets Venezuela as an enemy. The United States targets Iran as an enemy. So both Venezuela and Iran have a common enemy denominated in the United States. So I can understand why Iran will seek to bail out Venezuela by supplying either crude or refined petroleum. Now, this is a dangerous thing, however, for Iran to do, because Venezuela is so far for those ships, and they could be targets of all the enemies of Iran that you won't even know. All it takes is a submarine under the sea firing one volley and it will sink both ships. So it's a dangerous assignment. However, what Iran has proved capable of doing is retaliation. If you recall, when the British special services men jumped on to an Iranian ship and seized it, Iran quickly seized British ships passing through the Gulf of Hormuz and detained the ships until the Iranian ship was released by the British, and then the Iranians said the British ships could go. So if anyone attacks these two ships, problem could arise in the Gulf of Hormuz, through which a lot of ships, naval ships, oil-carrying ships coming from Southeast Asia and going to Europe. And that empowers Iran at retaliation. So hopefully the strategic thinkers in Washington and in Israel will think twice before attacking these two ships.
Thank you for that analysis, Prof. Let's go to Mali. Last week we talked about Mali, and one of the things you said shouldn't be done in that situation appears to be exactly what has happened. But from the African Union, mainly, and ECOWAS, who suspended Mali from those bodies, and also they are threatening sanctions, which you spoke very strongly against. What do you have to say to that, Prof?
Well, I'm not surprised, because France was pushing for those sanctions. But one issue which we should bring on board and upfront is what happened in Chad. There was a coup in Chad, and Chad looks like it is getting away with it. ECOWAS has not suspended Chad. France has supported Chad. The AU has not spoken. So why is Mali so different that and Mali will not be tolerated? That might have been what had encouraged the young Malian officers to push ahead with what they were doing and quickly got the Constitutional Court to ratify the appointment of the young colonel as president of Mali. Now, he's thrown out like you throw out a bone to a dog. He's thrown out a conciliatory move by appointing a civilian as prime minister. And it's left for us now to see how ECOWAS, African Union, and France will react to that. They have two options. They could grab the conciliatory move and accept in the hope that the young colonel will actually keep to his word and have elections when and if they are due. Stare him down and see who will blink first. You see, the silent agent or the silent operator in the background is Russia. It's Russia. I don't think it is China. I think it is Russia, because it is Russia that is extending its strategic clause. It's in Syria now. There are talks about southern Libya. There are certain movements into southern Libya by Russian operatives. So, but what I know is it was a foolish move by civilians appointed by the military to face down the military. You just see who holds the gun.
Prof, there's a question here in terms of the African Union. And looking at the African Union themselves, just this past week, we saw the whole issue of physical confrontations going on in Parliament. And there's an argument that says they're actually not organized enough to help drive the necessary change. What do you say to that?
I think it was embarrassing what happened in the chambers of the African Union Parliament. Very embarrassing for all of us, because it's not something, physical combat and physical confrontation and people threatening to kill people. Frankly, we are not used to that in African countries where there are parliaments. One or two, yes, maybe, but basically they behave themselves, carry out debates. ECOWAS has a parliament. I haven't heard of, yelling and confrontation and threat. They follow parliamentary procedure as we know it from Parliament in Britain. So this to me came as number one. Number two is unless there is a consensus among African states, the African Union, you are right, is not strong enough. This is like the United Nations. The African Union may have a legal personality, but it doesn't have an executive personality to drive issues independent of its members. It's just not, that's not the way it's configured.
All right, Prof. Let's move to Russia. Actually, sorry, there's a question here around the rising level of uh, uh, insecurity across Africa, Ethiopia, Mali, and we're seeing so many things going on. Are we starting to see one country's situation starting to embolden people in other countries and everybody now thinking, this is our chance, let's go for it? Is that what we're starting to see?
Well, I believe we are living an old world order and starting the putative steps towards a new world order. What will be the values of this new world order are being fought over between the United States on one hand, China and Russia on the other hand. People have seen how domestically the prime movers of the old order themselves have problems on their hands domestically. There are, until African countries accept that the key to stability in Africa lie in free, fair, and transparent elections. That will breed stable governments. And this stable government will be able to resist both external and internal attempts at subversion. But if governments are brought into being by elections which are neither free nor fair nor transparent, immediately the existence of each of those governments breeds tension within their own countries, which are then susceptible to either external or internal subversion. So people will always exploit situations from which they could pursue their political ambition. If you shut the door against political processes which are under the Constitution, allowed by the Constitution, if you shut the door against that, then these kind of things that you are talking about will happen. Remember what started up the Ethiopian thing, that because of COVID-19, the president, or is it the prime minister, postponed the elections. That's what started the open confrontation between the Tigray Liberation Movement, who felt that their people had a good chance of winning the election that had just been that had just been postponed.
Prof, there's a comment here saying that given what we've seen in the US, what we've seen in Russia, what we've seen in Belarus, it seems that this issue of increasing violence is not an African thing. It's extending way beyond the boundaries of Africa to all these other countries.
If you decipher what I said we are in the middle of transiting from an old world order to a new world order with competing values. And one of the competing values is stability versus human rights. So I didn't locate it within the African continent or within the African political system. Obviously, China, Russia, Belarus are putting more emphasis on stability than human rights, while the United States, European Union are putting emphasis on human rights.
Mm. Prof, let's go to Russia. But I'm going to link this to a question that's just popped up on Facebook, referring to a situation you addressed last week. And this was the issue in Belarus where an activist was taken off an airplane. Now, we've seen almost a repeat of that take place in Russia, where an airplane that was taxiing was stopped and a critic of the government was pulled off the airplane. Um, Prof, are we going to be seeing more of these kind of things?
You cannot equate what happened in Belarus with what happened in Russia. In Belarus, a plane was forced down under false pretenses. In the case of Russia, that plane was still taxiing on Russian air runway. It was still under Russian control, under control of of Russian air controllers. Now, one is not supporting Russia, what Russia did, but what Russia did, believe me, could happen in any country in the world. It could. Um, I recall, yes, I recall when I was a minister, when I was a foreign minister, two British pilots stole a private plane within Nigeria. The air controller ordered it to stop rolling, to stop taking off. It didn't comply. And it was when it was in the airspace of Cote d'Ivoire that the plane was forced to land and returned to Nigeria. So I'm sure if we could have scrambled Air Force planes, we would have forced it to land since it was still within Nigerian airspace and it was taken off against the instructions of the air controllers. So that one was within our own airspace, and the plane was still within our territory. It wasn't overflying our territory as it happened in Belarus. It wasn't. So that could happen in any country. I'm sure that if the CIA or even the FBI had information that somebody of interest to them was on a plane about to take off from Washington Dulles Airport or John F. Kennedy Airport in New York, and they want him, the planes will stop.
Mhm. Prof, that leads us to the issue of the Overflight Treaty, where the Russian upper house has now voted to withdraw from that Overflight Treaty. Do you think that's the right thing for them to have done?
I think in this case, we will have to say yes. Recall, I mean, the full narrative was that Trump had withdrawn from that treaty. But for the sake of our listeners, let me say what the treaty is all about. The signatories to the treaty have allowed planes belonging to the signatories to the treaty to overfly their military establishments in order to create an atmosphere of certainty and trust that if they see a movement of troops in one country, uh, um, they could easily be alerted and seek for information as regards the purpose of the movement of the troops. They don't need to jump to conclusion and immediately scramble their own planes. That was the purpose of the treaty, to which, they all signed on. Now, Trump withdrew from the treaty. I don't know whether it was 2018 or 2019. He withdrew from the treaty. The Russians continued their membership of the treaty. But during the campaign, Biden said he criticized Trump and said he will return to the treaty. Now, Biden had changed his mind and said he wasn't going back to the treaty. The Russians asked other European countries who are members of the treaty to give them an assurance that they will not share data which they collect with the Americans. The Europeans refused. Now, what do you want the Russians to do? So the Russians, of course, going through their own constitutional processes, the upper house, the Senate, has now said Russia should also pull out of the treaty so that Russia is not put at a disadvantage. See, obedience to treaty is about complicity. You agree on your obligations and you agree on your responsibilities. It cannot be one-sided. And I expect Putin, frankly, to sign that resolution from his. I don't even think that his Senate would have done so without being prodded by Putin. So I expect Putin to do so. And I think it's a dangerous thing that the United States has done because you could end up with misunderstood signals and misplaced signals and misinterpreted signals on troop movement, air movement. The Americans could feel that they could depend on their satellites and that therefore they are not going to allow foreign aircraft to overfly their territory. But pictures taken by aircraft has more clarity than pictures taken by satellite. And I think my own advice to both the United States and Putin will be to find their way back to that treaty.
Mhm. Prof, before we leave Russia, there's a point someone has raised here, which was around, I think sometime last year, we touched on this program, or maybe earlier on in the year. And this was when Russia chose Sudan as a point for a military base. There was going to be a huge investment in Sudan at the time. And then the American Secretary of State came in. They removed Sudan from one of the countries on the list of terror states. But now that the former president has been moved out, Sudan's military chief has said that they are reviewing that whole arrangement that they had with Russia and that military base. What would you advise Sudan to do in this case?
I think it's been a fundamental principle of African foreign policy strategy not to have military bases in Africa. As far back as 1960, when this flood of independence by African states came in, you will even recall that in Nigeria there was riot, student riot, trade union riot, because part of the agreement attached to Nigerian independence was that Britain will have a base in Nigeria, and Nigerians thought that will compromise their independence, and that had to be cancelled. So we've been a prime mover. When I say we, Nigerians have been a prime mover, and the OEU endorsed it, and the African Union also has endorsed as a principle not to have military bases. For a simple reason, you don't want to get caught in other people's problems. And if it then comes to being sacrificed, you will get sacrificed. And in the meantime, you've made enemies of maybe people you shouldn't make enemies of, but because of the presence of a military base on your territory, you've entered all kind of foreign policy quagmire that you should avoid. So my advice to the new Sudan military chief and government is that if they could avoid it, they should avoid having a foreign military base on their territory.
Hmm. Thank you, Prof. Let's move to China. Um, we seem to get this double-sided message coming out of China. On the one hand, we hear the president talking about a more lovable foreign policy and diplomatic stance. On the other hand, we're hearing state media talking about the country and telling the country to prepare for nuclear war with the US. Prof, help us to understand the dynamic that's going on here in terms of this stance from China.
Um, I read the full statement by the gentleman who was talking about um, nuclear preparedness. And there was nothing that alarmed me there, because it was only re-emphasizing and making reference to what we've known. I've even talked about it on this program, which is the doctrine of unacceptable damages. The doctrine of unacceptable damages. If two countries are going to be involved in a conflict, and one country is a superpower, under normal circumstances, you will expect that the other country will if that other country, which is not as powerful as the superpower, but can deliver a few blows that the superpower may find unacceptable and therefore not worth the risk, the superpower will hesitate in taking on even this smaller power. Now, let's put that within the context of what the man was talking about. Obviously, right now, the United States, using its nuclear means, can defeat China in any engagement. But suppose China has the nuclear capability to hit 3 or 4 American cities. Would the United States be prepared to risk the annihilation of those 3 or 4 cities, even though it is going to wipe out China? And the answer invariably is usually no, especially if the conflict with China is not one that threatens, that poses an existential threat to the United States. Maybe it should be a conflict over Taiwan. Maybe it will be a conflict over Hong Kong. Maybe it will even be a conflict over Australia or New Zealand. The United States will not be in a position to threaten China if it makes an assessment that China's nuclear weapons, China's delivery system can reach the United States. Between Russia and the United States during the Cold War was not dependent on parity between the United States and Russia. There's been no time when there's been parity. America had always had, a superiority of naval vessels, of aircraft, of even the quantity of nuclear weapons. It had always, but Russia got to that point where it could deliver its own limited nuclear weapons on the United States. And so that's why we call it balance of terror. Others even call it balance of madness. But the two nuclear powers at that time proved that they were not mad, but they were rational enough to maintain the peace between the two of them. It didn't stop them sponsoring conflicts in other parts of the world and using, Vietnam, the Middle East, and a few other places fighting their wars of conflict with between the United States and and Russia, but they never allowed it to get to the stage where they would then be exchanging. So that's what the man was talking about. He was just reiterating this doctrine of unacceptable damages in a conflict between the two powers. The second point, which came up very wisely, in my view, was the president of China asking his officials, government officials, ambassadors, and to be civilized in their exchange of discourse, in their comments, in what they write on social media, in what ambassadors say on television interviews. He wanted them to stop making enemies for China by the kind of language that they use. You recall, maybe 30 minutes ago, I was talking about the language of confrontation coming out of Iran itself, that Iran was busy making enemies for itself, that one even found it difficult to defend Iran. I think China has come to the conclusion that his style of diplomacy was making enemies for it. So, in a way, the two are compatible. Speak softly, but carry a big AK-47. But speak softly. And in fact, it was who was not Theodore Roosevelt, an American president, who actually came up with that saying of, speaking softly but carrying a big weapon in your hand. Let your weapon speak for you and not your voice. And I think
Wow.
the Chinese have just come now to a realization that their diplomacy in the past 10 years hasn't done them much good. I hope it will be more than noise, because their behavior in Africa has been atrocious. Economically, militarily, it's been atrocious. And I don't see how signing on equal economic agreements with African countries or Southeast Asian countries will make you friends in the long run. So I hope it's not just speaking softly. I hope it's also behaving softly.
Yes.
Let me not calm down Russia too much, because even our agreements with Western corporations are also unequal agreements. But they know the way they put it, that we don't really, the French with their colonial tax in Africa, and yet Macron is still posturing as a friend
Yeah.
of Africa. We say it almost every week on this program. So
Yeah.
maybe the Chinese want to learn a lesson from the French.
Prof, there's one question I want to put to you, two in one actually. And it's regarding Buckingham Palace. Um, the first part is this issue where it was uncovered in the course of the week in some documents from the archives that Buckingham Palace actually banned ethnic minorities from office jobs. But also, we see something quite interesting today, where Buckingham Palace also released the news that President Biden will be visiting the Queen while he's here for the G7 summit later on this month. And the question here is this, Prof. Number one, we have the ethnic issue. Number two, we have President Biden choosing to meet with the Queen on his first visit. Is that normal? or is it unusual for the American president to do that?
Um, I don't see the connection between the two. I will have drawn a connection between the racism of the palace and the very warm relationship Queen, Prince Philip, the late Prince Philip, and the Obamas. It was a very warm relationship. And you then kind of wonder what kind of a split personality behavior that the palace is capable of. Um, I'm not surprised that such a document will exist. It's the fact that they even put it on paper that will surprise me. Well, now that people say there's no systemic racism in Britain, they deny that there's a systemic palace. William was asked, and he said there's no racism, in my family. And yet, this has been there all along. And yet, they created a commonwealth that included people of color and presidents of color, prime ministers of color were entertained in the palace. Um, you know, I to wrap it around my head, it shows the duplicity of the upper class in Britain. Having said that, let me, however, say that I'm aware. I hope I'm not being mistaken. You could check and correct me next week. But I'm aware that I think the ADC, the aide-de-camp to the Queen, is now a man of color or a man of ethnic nationalities. I don't know what you want us to use to describe ourselves. I believe the last time there was something in Windsor Castle, a parade in Windsor Castle. I thought I saw in this their long bug bear hat or bear whatever it is. I think it was a man of color. I even believe he was from Africa. But as I said, you could check. However, this duplicity will continue. Probably until maybe the palace, as I advocated when the issue of Meghan came up, that perhaps an office of ethnic nationalities will be created in the palace, and a sufficient high rank, maybe headed by a retired British ambassador of color, to give it dignity and give it gravitas. Until you have that, we will just be wasting our breath, arguing whether there's systemic racism in the palace or not.
All right, Prof. We've literally run out of time now. Thank you for your comments on all these issues. To our viewers, thank you for being there. Right from, like we said, I think last week or so. Every time we come in here, we see the numbers there going up from week to week. Thank you all for being there. Over the next week is going to be 1 year, Prof. Next week will be 1 year of running this program. Thank you, Prof, for being there. We must say that for joining every week.
Are we going to exchange glasses of champagne, you and I?
I can make that happen. You get yours, I'll get mine.
No, 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 no. You provide. I'll join you. in clinging glasses.
Okay, Prof, I will do something. I will surprise you.
Good. We have a deal. We have
Thank
a
you
deal.
so much, Prof. Thank you so much,
It's a
Prof.
pleasure. A pleasure.
All right. And to our viewers, see you again next week.